and welcome to the penultimate event in our series, Policing in the Time of Pandemic. This morning and tomorrow morning's workshops are being hosted by Rod Jarman, and we'll look at events in 2020 that have impacted and affected the police-public relationship. Before we get going, I would just like to thank and welcome our guests again this morning from Peru, via Switzerland, China and Cambodia, as well as our guests with us in the UK. So welcome to you all. So the format for this morning is very similar to previous workshops insofar as when Rod's doing his presentation, we'll be asking people to add their comments, thoughts, questions in the chat, which is on the right-hand side, because that has actually been a really interesting, interactive way of hearing people's ideas and insights. And then when there's an appropriate point in the presentation, we can reflect those to Rod and he can share his thoughts on some of your questions. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Rod and enjoy the session. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning to everybody. I think just wait for the computer to catch up with me. So excuse me just a second, because this is not, it says it's sharing my screen, but it clearly isn't at the moment. So, Karen and Daisy, I have not got PowerPoint coming up as one of the options to share. So I'm presuming I've done something completely wrong. So just, if everyone could just bear with me for 1 second.
You were sharing the screen for a little bit, Rod.
Okay, I'll do it this way, and hopefully this will work.
Okay, it's sharing now. Okay.
Well, good morning, everybody, and that's always a good start when the person who's supposed to be able to use the IT struggles with it at the very beginning. But anyway, let's move on from there quickly. It's a real great pleasure to be here today, particularly to have some people from so many parts of the world. And what I really hope is that we can share some of the experiences of people this year, and particularly look at how those impacted the police-public relationship. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that. So we've got some about an hour and a half this morning. We'll have a break some way through this so that you get a chance to get away from the screen, because otherwise it's a bit painful. And as Karen said, I really want to hear questions and things. So if you have any questions, please just put them in the chat, and Karen will make sure that Karen and Daisy will make sure I deal with them. I'd like to just start off with by going back and saying, over this series of workshops, we've looked at crisis management, we've looked at police education, and then we've looked at two operational issues which have come up for policing. One of those was around cybercrime, which was the workshop this week, and the other one was around harmful practices, which was the workshop, one of the workshops from last week. And next week, we want to look at a very operational event from a number of countries, and really looking forward to hearing from other places about their experiences over this year. So today I'm going to try and have a look at some of the impact of these various situations, the various events that have happened, and see how we can use that for a positive, or see how it might be used negatively. So I've thought about this in terms of legitimacy and performance, and I'll explain what I mean by legitimacy shortly. But really, this is about thinking, what do the police do, why do they do it, and how supportive are the public of those police actions, and how important is that support. Now, I've looked at a number of things, and we sort of played around this, around policing and public demonstrations. So we'll start off this morning with a sort of overview from me, and then we'll look specifically around the police response in the UK to a couple of demonstrations which occurred as part of the Black Lives Matter campaign. But before we do that, I think we just need to sort of put policing in a historical context. 1829 was the Metropolitan Police, and though I think we've got some people from Scotland here today, we know that the Glasgow Police was created slightly before, but the one police service that people look around the world as the home for modern policing was created by Sir Robert Peel, and has, over that nearly 200 years, developed considerably from that initial force, which was basically an extension of the local magistrates. And I would put that in three phases. The first phase was industrialisation, and that's looking at how policing is done, looking at how you can codify crimes, how you can present evidence to courts, creating offences rather than everything being against the common law. And then we started to get some science coming in with Locard's principle. This is the basics of forensics. Every contact leaves a trace, and how that started to change the way we thought about policing. We then had a stage where policing moved into a wider arena. In the first instance, the police were struggling against not being really wanted by society, but it was about the male element of society, the mainstream society not wanting it. As we moved into the 20th century, legitimacy became a different type of debate. It was about the rest of the population, the 51% of the UK population, which is female, about how women would come into the service and become part of policing, but also about how police services were offered to them, how people could contact the police, the free 999 system, which is how people could telephone, or the use of these police boxes. And then eventually, when we got into the 1970s, the sort of realization that women were able to do the same jobs as men, and that really we ought to be working differently. So that was a very significant change in terms of policing from the initial start. And then the last chunk I've sort of labelled as the information age, as we've moved from bobbies walking on the beat, police officers on foot patrol, into vehicles, the use of radios, and then some sort of databases that enabled us to take fingerprints very quickly and analyse them, DNA, and also the whole way that we deployed officers changing. So through those three phases, we've seen policing change quite considerably. But it is still the same thing. And we've got a short poll that we just wanted to ask you some questions so we get some feeling for how people are. So Daisy, would you like to do that? So what we'd like to know is, what should the measure of police effectiveness be? Should it be the number of people convicted of offences, the number of calls from the public dealt with, the lack of crime, or the number of arrests? And if you could just choose one of those now quickly, and we'll try and get as many people's choices on. You should be able to click them on your screen and then press submit, and we'll have a look to see what comes from that. So just a few more seconds, if you could make a choice, that would be great. So we need to see the results. Here we are. So no one thought it was the number of convictions. No one thought it was the number of calls from the public. 77% thought it was the lack of crime, and 22% thought it was the number of arrests. And that's really helpful start, because we'll move on here, going back to Peel's principles. Peel defined the object of police as the absence of crime and disorder. So very simply, what people reflected in that poll, rather than police action. So we should be looking at, according to Robert Peel in 1829, how we can prevent crime from happening. And the key element about how we do this, number 8 out of his 9 principles, was the police are the public and the public are the police. And whilst policing, as we just went through, has changed quite considerably, I would argue that these 2 key elements are still right at the heart of policing. And what they provide for us is 2 things: a measure of performance, the absence of crime and disorder, and a measure of legitimacy, are the police and the public, are police seen as the public, and are the public part of policing? The problem with these 2 measures is it's extremely hard to make an argument for money on the process that there's no crime and disorder, therefore we need more police officers, is not one that many politicians with budgets would actually accept. And the other one is it's very hard to actually measure this concept of police and public being seen as the same as each other. So when we move on from there, we need to think a little bit more about what is the policing role, what is it nowadays, and how is that defined and measured. So I've sort of taken 3 key elements that I think we should be looking at. One of them is relationships, how the police and the community interact. The second bit is the police role. What are the police there to do? And it's quite clear that the police nowadays are not an organisation who deliver one specific thing, but over those 200 years in the UK, policing role has merged into social services, it's merged into emergency health services, it's merged at times into emergency fire response. So we've expanded what policing is about through those 200 years, and it's almost as if that police role has no boundaries. You know, as a 24/7 emergency service, if nobody else is available, who are people going to call? They call the police. So that's always going to be an issue for us, but is a particular one, I think, at the moment. And the last one is about police powers. And when you talk about the police and the public, you know, officers being members of the public who have specific powers, we have to realise that the use of force is quite fundamental to how people think about policing and how important it is in terms of society. So I sort of broke these down a little bit more. So when we think about relationships, this is not just about the officers, their relationship with other individuals, but it's also around officers' relationships with communities and officers' relationships with the state. And you could, you know, think about this in terms of sociology, or you could think about this in terms of politics. But nowadays, it's quite a complex expectation on a police officer to think about the individual they're providing a service to think about the various communities who might want to access those services and who might also be there to help in resolving the problem, and to think about the focus that the state is providing them. And this year in the UK, we've seen a massive change in this relationship as the state has fundamentally told the police that their mission has changed from one of what we would think of as traditional crime into one of managing a health issue. The next one I'm thinking about the police role. The definition would say it's probably something to do with investigation. You know, in the UK, this is set within law that actually the police officers are the investigative people for crimes. But it's also about prevention. We talked just now about us all thinking that absence of crime was the main issue. But we've often, for the last 30 or 40 years, thought about this in this country as being about safety, how we can make individuals and communities and society safer. Now, to do that, you have to think about a whole number of different things, from criminology to psychology to forensics to criminal justice, and come up with some fairly complex models about how we deliver policing and how individual officers should act when they're doing things. And this puts a lot of strain on the officers because they're asked to fulfill a number of different roles at the same time. And whilst that is happening, they're also asked to deal with anything that nobody else hasn't dealt with on that particular day. So we need to think quite clearly about what the police role is, particularly in a year like this year where so many things have changed. And then the last element I sort of was looking at was around the use of force. Now, the most fundamental sign of the use of force here is it has been for many years described around stop and search, the ability of police officers with reasonable grounds to suspect somebody is carrying something illegal, that you can stop them and search them to find those items. Now that force, that power is used in a number of different ways, and as a result of it, it creates problems with particular communities. And as we've seen over the last, well, as we see right across the board, a disproportionate use of this power against BAME, black and ethnic minority or minority ethnic communities. So stop and search is symbolic of the use of force in this country, but we also have the public order, the use of force during mass demonstrations, and we also have the use of force when we're trying to keep people safe at events, you know, the corralling of people going to sporting events and that type of event as well. So in this area, we're thinking about what is the law, we have to think about criminology, what we're trying to achieve from it. We need to think about the psychology of how officers get people to comply with them, because I was taught to think about the use of police power as the iron fist in the velvet glove, the concept that as far as possible, you are as nice as possible, you use the minimum, absolute minimum use of force, and you try and talk people into doing some things. But if they don't do what you want, then at the end of the day, you've got to be able to use the powers that you have in order to achieve an outcome. So this sort of concept of the different powers and the different roles and the relationships leads us to a number of different issues. And I just want to ask another quick poll, some of your thoughts about what was the biggest issue, thinking about these things as the backdrop. What was the biggest issue for police in 2020? Was it COVID-19 or was it Black Lives Matter? So if you could just take a few seconds to make a choice on that. So it's very interesting, 3/4 of those who voted thought it was COVID-19 and 1/4 thought it was Black Lives Matter. And what I want to do over the next sort of chunk of this workshop is look at how those things have come together and how important both of those aspects have been to the police. So what can we learn from this year? So we've got these big issues around COVID-19, Black Lives Matter. So if you see BLM on here, BLM, that means Black Lives Matter, and social media. We've got this changing mission for police as a response of that. You know, what are the police here to do? Suddenly here to enforce people staying in their homes rather than committing crime. Issues around disproportionality and fairness have suddenly come into the open, and we're starting to see things, and social media has given us the ability to discuss these things in a less controlled way. So historically, although there has been a debate about disproportionality going back 40, 50 years, it has been fairly confined to those people to whom it's particularly relevant. With social media, we've been able to open that up to many more people, but also we have this concept of people only speaking to people with similar views. So the impact of it has become condensed as well, has become magnified. We're going to look a little bit about some theory and research and information about what those mean. But what I really want us to get to is what can we learn from this year about the impact for officers. And we're going to look at this legitimacy and performance as the two key elements. So I wanted to start off by looking at the history and the immediacy. So what's happened in the past which impacts upon now, and what's happening upon now which clearly impacts upon now. And I always think about this in terms of people having long and short-term memories. Whenever, in all of my policing experience, whenever you deal with people who are aggrieved about something, they have a very long memory of what aggrieved them. And when you talk to people about something that they're very pleased with, they have a very short memory about what's happened. And when you look at positive things, they tend to be fairly small in terms of their impact. And when you look at negative things, they tend to be very large. So we need to look at the history and the context within which things are happening, as well as what's actually happening at the moment. And this has been a big issue in discussion, particularly in the Black Lives Matter debate, but the whole concept of the impact of slavery upon society, and how much of the Western, and not just the Western actually, how much of the world's wealth has been based upon the trade of people, and how much that happened and how that is still ingrained in the way we think about society. And of course, the big thing about slavery is we all like to talk about it and say this is something that happened in the past, but it's still going on today. There are significant numbers of people being trafficked into wealthier countries, and when they arrive in wealthier countries, they are sold into a form of slavery. They may not even know that they were being trafficked. They may have thought that they are being brought in on their own will, but when they arrive, they have their passport, any possibility of living separately taken away from them and completely controlled. So slavery has been a big issue, and particularly historically it was a big issue because it tended to be on black and white divide. So most of the black African people coming to the Caribbean islands and then into North America and through the United Kingdom and through other European countries mixed with the white community who had the power and the money. So the first thing we've got to think about is that history. The second one is sort of how power is still used today in a way which controls people. So if you look at the Colin Kaepernick taking a knee at the national anthem, the way his career was taken away from him, he was degraded for what he did in turning to stand up for what he saw as abuses of human rights and how he wanted to see the United States do something different, ended his career, stopped playing, a tremendous football player, suddenly having it all taken away from him, and society turning against him because of it. So these things may be in the past, but the use of power is still there to maintain a situation of imbalance. Then, of course, we move to George Floyd this week, and really the question that I need to keep on coming back to is, why did this particular incident gather such momentum, not just in the US, but right across the world, leading to disorder in Europe, in Australia, elements of Africa? There was huge outcry across the world about this. And what was it particularly that happened in this event that made it different? Was it the fact that it was filmed? But I can think of many other events that have been filmed. You go back to Rodney King, which was 25 years ago, maybe longer than that ago. That was on film, had a big impact because it was on film. But between then, the growth of mobile phone technology, body-worn videos means we've had many of these incidents. So what was it particular about this one? Or was it the very personal appeals he made to say he can't breathe, to ask for help, talking to his dead mother during that 8 minutes and 47 seconds that he was held down. What was it particularly about this incident that derived such international impact? I think the other thing is this, in the US, there have been over 100 black people die in 10 years through the use of police force. Now, mustn't just think this is an American issue. In the UK in 2019, there were 146 deaths following police contact. Now, the vast majority of those are people who have taken their own lives, or some other incident has happened. They're not to do with a medical emergency. They're not to do with the way that the police specifically dealt with them. A significant number were from road traffic collisions, but there were still people who were shot. There were people who died as a result of the way they were restrained. And although it's not quite so stark in terms of its disproportionality, we know that Asian people are more likely to be killed in police custody than white people. We know men are more likely to be killed in police custody or following police custody than women, sorry. And then we've had this social media campaign this year, this whole drive towards creating a movement. So Black Lives Matter isn't new. It's been around for quite a long time as political movement. But this year, they managed to capture this in a way which they hadn't done before. And it was, I think, primarily because it moved out of those people who had the same views. It moved into people who had a number of different views. And that leads us to sort of having a debate about it. And I think it's that debate which primarily changed the way people thought about it. So I've just sort of tried to pull out the key things that I think made this slightly different. But I think it'd be quite useful, Karen, I don't know if there are any comments in the chat box, but if people could start putting in some of their thoughts about what, in terms of history and immediacy, has made this year different. So taking away the actual activities of policing around COVID-19, taking away the demonstrations, what else might have been happening in society that would make life a little bit different? So I see Sundajet has sort of talked about the shooting in the USA and the impact of the shootings, and that there's something about that which is different from where the use of force is very specifically intended to kill somebody, which it is when people are shot by police, and how that's impacted. Are there any other things people think have been particularly important in driving the events around diversity and BAM? Yeah, I think the whole concept of recession, Brexit, job losses, all those are key issues for us to think about. And somebody's raised the whole issue of Donald Trump. I think political leadership is a key issue here, that if we don't have leaders who are willing to stand up and take something forward, how can other people make a difference? And then that's quite interesting. So the comment about people being at home, away from work. So they were in a position to pay closer attention. So somehow this has managed to get into that wider debate. Very, very interesting point. And the whole concept of isolation. So if people feel isolated, how do these things? So what I want to do now, so thank you for those comments. What I want to do now is just sort of move on to some of the things that have happened this year, which also have played into this. So really think about Black and minority ethnic individuals and police action. So BAME is a term used in the United Kingdom to talk about Black, Asian and other minority ethnic communities. So these are these are British people who might have a different skin colour, basically, and how has that impacted upon police data? So we see that they're 50% more likely to be arrested for breaching the laws. We've also seen they're 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19, and that this disparity is not just due to health and economic differences. There's something else going on, but we don't understand it. So during this year in particular, we've seen the use of police powers, a disproportionate use of them against BAME communities, and for many members, those things are recorded on social media. They become in themselves a discussion, and we've seen this rise in death and rise in concern around health, and also that on a disproportionate level. So what impacts would this have? So, you know, I think you picked up some of them in the chat just now, the fear and feelings of insecurity, a deep consideration around fairness, what is going on in the society at the moment and what is happening in the world, and why is this happening? This question of what is going on at the moment to lead us to these points. Why should we be having all these things come together, and why should they particularly impact on one element of society? Now, there's a theory called terror management theory, and I will put on the materials a reference for this for people to have a look at. And this, in short, suggests that people's motives are often driven, they come from an instinct for self-preservation. So people do things to protect themselves, and there's a lot of sociological theory which talks about us coming together in order to protect ourselves from the possibility of war of all against all if we don't create groups. So there's a lot of, this is not a new theory, this has been around for a while, and it suggests that the culture, the way we do things, provides us symbols of a sense of order. And by that we mean things like if everybody's treated fairly, then that means that society is ordered, and that order provides meaning, stability and permanence. So we can think that we are safe because the culture provides us a series of symbols of things that show things are working. And when these symbols are challenged, then people's anxieties lose this mechanism for management. So this year we have seen massive challenge to the symbol of the fact that we're all in everything together. We're all as equally likely to get ill as each other, and we're all as equally likely to have police use force against us as each other. Both of those have been taken out. And when you think about self-preservation, those are key elements of this type of what we've seen happen this year, of the outcomes from this year's changes. And I've sort of broken this down into thinking about safety. So we've had COVID-19, we had what happened with George Floyd, but also on the other side, Eric Gardner. And then on the other side, we've got this young white male seen walking around carrying an assault weapon, not perceived by the police to be a threat. So, sometimes there is something going on around perceptions of safety. There is something going on around police officers' perceptions of safety, which are really, really quite complex to understand. There's a big thing around fairness. And I've talked here about, I've focused here on the COVID-19 force, but there's also within policing in the UK, a whole number of things around fairness on police progression, on the use of police discipline, where we know that BAME officers are far more likely to be disciplined than white officers, and we know that their progression is far slower. So all these things around fairness, both inside the police and in society, are playing out. We've had all this social media to drive this forward and to really capture things with images, to capture things with stories. And stories are so important in forming culture, the whole how you describe things. And then we've got anxiety and the need for action. And this for me is probably where we've had a real focus on the demonstrations and the what's happened in the demonstrations and how serious these have been for policing. And I'm going to move on to the demonstrations in a little while. But I think that if you think about things in these terms, we can see why this year has been particularly crucial for police, and the need for police to actually find a position in society where they can deal with that. But at the same time, the focus of police has been on something else. We mustn't forget, as a commentator rather than a police officer, which is what I am at the moment, we mustn't forget that the police force had to produce a new form of PPE, new ways of working, had to move into different approaches because suddenly we were asking the police to deal with new things. And the whole focus of everybody, society and everyone, was around COVID-19. And this was being seen as a background issue. We've had huge political uncertainty this year. We've got in the UK uncertainty about Brexit, which is still rumbling around in the background. In the US, we've got a presidential election. And across the world, there has been uncertainty about what are the right things to be focusing on. We've lost any concept of a world response to a world pandemic. It has become down to individual countries. And I think the thing that struck me when I was researching this most was the lack of a plan. Those of you who were on Roger's crisis workshop at the beginning of this series will have seen the whole planning issue being as very important as the preparation before we come to deal with things being the sort of key elements. Well, on this year, when you look at the plans, if you look at the UK National Resilience Plan, when we're talking about pandemic, and it is in there, the response is around health, and the police are seen as doing something around the side of it, not seen as having a core role in enforcing health issues. So there's a whole concept here that we didn't plan in enough detail for it. We've been living in crisis mode for a long time. We've had huge political uncertainty, and we've had this focus on COVID-19. And I think the point that I just wanted to move on from that is it doesn't need to be this way. I think we could change things quite significantly just using the same models and thinking about the same things. If we were to recognise BAME fears more openly, if we didn't sort of talk about it as compartmentalised different things, but looked at the aggregation of all these issues, if we had more focus on what people give to society in terms of contribution. So if you look at any of the images about health workers who have died in the UK, you cannot be anything other than struck by the diversity of those photographs. When you look at all of the issues, the people who have made the choice to come to the UK to work, who've made the choice to stand up against unfairness, and who have joined, for instance, police officers who have joined from BAME communities where their community may well have been quite sceptical of them doing it, we need to be recognising that much bigger. And Black History Month is a way of doing that, but it shouldn't be Black History Month. That should be something we do all the time. And the other thing I think which is really worrying for me is we focus, because of the Black Lives Matter political agenda, on one element of diversity, and we're not really thinking about people with disabilities. We're not thinking about the implications for the elderly. We aren't actually recognising that this is the same thing for other people, but it's not maybe not played out in the same way. We need to do something about addressing inequalities, but we've been talking about this for a long time. So the use of force and the perceptions of risk, the use of force in particular around inequality is really important, but also progression within the organisation, discipline, all of these things where things seem to be out of kilter need to be tackled head on. And we need to do something about perceptions of risk. I was so struck around the concept that a black man walking away from the police was seen as a huge threat, so he was shot 7 times in the back. A 17-year-old boy who's gone into a demonstration carrying an assault weapon, who happened to be white, is not seen as somebody who needs to be challenged. If we cannot get that right as a society, then we probably are going to have these issues going on forever. And I do think this whole providing symbols needs to be a little bit wider than it is at the moment. We need more political leadership, and we need to look at PAME progression. So I think that's quite, you know, there's a lot of downloading from me. What I'd like to do is to take a 5-minute break. And when we come back from there, I'd just like to have a little bit of a conversation about what people think, where they agree, and more importantly, where they disagree with the argument I've put forward. So if we could sort of everybody get 5 minutes, think about, from what you've heard, what would you agree with? What would you want to add to? And at least as important, if not more important, what do you disagree with? Where do you think this argument has got it wrong? And then I'll be asking some questions when we come back. So can we put a timer up for people so that they've got 5 minutes to come back? Is that possible?
Yeah,
Yes,
stop now.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Presentation, and there's lots of
Okay, I think that's the 5 minutes, and most people probably should be back by now. Rod, can we pick up a couple of points from before the break, just to cover?
Oops, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. Yeah, I think the couple that I had were about were the P&D, were the fixed penalty notices and the arrests at demonstrations, or were they in some other arena? So the data I gave you was particularly up to the 14th of May. So this was before the big demonstrations took place, before death of George Floyd. I cannot answer whether they were there at other demonstrations or not, but they definitely did not include the ones from the demonstrations we're going to talk about shortly. The other issue was about, or were they parties? I think one of the things which is really important for me is not so much that we look at how these things happened and where they happened, but far more what the implications of them are, and how we think about mitigating those implications. So I think is a really good question to ask, is where are they? But where is the messaging from anybody to explain this? Where is this being thought of as an important issue, one that is so important that we should be discussing? That just hasn't happened. It's almost like we've, just moved on. And the point I was trying to make is the more times you do that, the more issues you leave unresolved, the greater the risks over the longer term. So, Ian, I think that was you. Does that answer your point?
Yes, Rod, it was me. It definitely answers the points. But I remember it's quite interesting when you talk about, and I think you put it up earlier in your slides, about power and perception of police and the role in the community, because there's also the perception of what this is doing to police rank and file, because I don't know if you remember, but where we were shown very many times withdrawing from situations in the early part of COVID where people were locked down, I think a lot of rank and file and retire were going, well, what on earth is happening there? And were we losing our, bit like going back to what you said about the glove and the persuasion until you have to take the power. And I think a lot of us were thinking, what has changed? And I'm sure because you talk about knees in the forefront of the presentation, that we're going to talk about a bit about how the police are perceiving all of this as well, and how it affects our public perception. So a lot to think about, but yeah, it definitely answered my question. Thank you.
Thanks. So it'd be really interesting to get some other people's views on this, particularly people who've looked at this and thought of, I've just presented quite a strong position on things. Is there another position that we should be looking at? Is there another side to this debate which isn't coming out as strongly as it should be? And that's not a rhetorical question. It'd be really nice if someone could come up with something.
Well, while people think about that, there is one more question just in the chat from Johnny about the position that the government, and he's obviously in his point referring to Trump in the USA, fueling some of the disorder and the messaging, and where that leaves the police almost caught in the middle. And it's the same could be said here as well. And how do you think that works? How important do you think that balance is, and where does that leave the police when they're trying to balance government message here and the impact of their actions on the community, and that bit in between?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, a really hard one to answer in an international context as well. I think if you look across the world, in many countries, we've had a series of changes in leadership, in not just in terms of who the leader is, but in the style of leadership. So you look at, in America, we have Trump as a presidential leader. In this country, we have Boris Johnson, who sort of, in many ways, is emulating the same approaches to things, personalising everything very much in himself. In other nations, And in doing that, they are trying to change very quickly what things are and how things are done. And with COVID-19, there was a requirement to change the way policing delivered very, very quickly, but it sort of played into this political approach that's been taken at the moment, particularly in the US and the UK. I think really fundamentally, we've seen a number of politicians fail to really understand the depths of feeling and the depths of concern of some of these issues, and therefore not get on the front foot about dealing with it and dealing with the symbol. When we talk a little bit more in a moment about disorder in London and in Bristol, the initial response is we've got to police this very hard, we've got to get on with it, but really not actually listening to what's behind it. And the other thing which I think is, we need, and we need from political leaders, is a little bit less of wrapping themselves around with police officers behind them. I don't know, every major disaster, and I know on one hand this looks good because the police, the fire service, all the emergency services are being seen to actually having been and doing things, which is important. But when they are standing next to a political leader who is making a political statement, that separation disappears and we become more aligned to them. So if the politicians don't grab the situation, we're in a bit of a problem. I think David raised an issue here about do we need to start planning for greater breakdown in law and order? I think looking sort of moves on from that political debate, looking at what's happened in the northwest of England in the last few weeks, in terms of the debate about moving to a higher level of restrictions around COVID control, and how the political leaders there and the national political leaders have fallen out publicly over what should be done and how it should be done. I think that that does not bode well for a stable society and does not bode well for things in the future. And therefore, there's a need to think about that. And if there is a shortage of commodities, if there is even less money for people to buy the things, then that will cause us more problems. Sorry, the silence is while I'm just reading one of the questions. I think there's a really good point here about all of these things are additional activities for police, and have we had new resourcing put into policing? So there has been some additional resourcing put in, but it's additional resourcing for law enforcement. It's not really thinking about the long-term implications of what we need to deal with and how we might go about them. So I do think there are real concerns about, for me, real concerns about policing and the police role in society and how that works in the future, based upon the very sudden changes we've had to make in terms of policing priorities, new crimes, increasing crimes in private places, the use of technology, and therefore the very complex data protection issues that come with it. All of those are adding to the police on one side, police officer safety on the other side, and then of course, historically we've seen in depressions increases in crime and therefore some risks around that. So there's a lot to think about here and a lot of potential issues. And this concept of a COVID marshal, which I've never really seen defined as anything, and I think the only definition that's come out is it's whatever locally people want. As a different type of role from a PCSO. So we have these police community support officers in the UK. These are people with less powers than a police officer, but still have some powers, patrol in uniform. And how does this all fit together? And how do we get all of these new policing elements working? So thank you very much for that. I think one of the things that we're going to have a little bit more of a conversation around demonstrations and policing demonstrations. But I think sorry, I'm just reading a couple of issues here, international ones, which are really useful. I think there is a whole change that's happened since the series of events known as the Arab Spring, about how social media and how communication channels outside of normal controls have led demonstrators to work differently. And I know from a policing demonstration in the UK, one of the key things has been a move to actually monitoring social media, to thinking about what are the conversations and therefore what are the responses. But we have to create ways of doing those within systems. We have to try and move people into a debate which is in the right element. I think what we'll do now is move on slightly. And yes, Ian, thank you very much for changing GOAT to government, which is always a better demonstration. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the police response to demonstrations in London. And what I really would like to do between today and tomorrow is to get people to think about the impact on individual officers. One of the points that was raised in the context. The whole in the chat notes. We've seen in London this year the murder of a police sergeant in the custody suite, Matt Ratana, who's clearly a person who has come to this country, a New Zealand national, who's come over here, become part of the community, had a huge amount of public support outside policing, and was clearly thought of extremely well within the police service. And doing his job was shot and murdered by a prisoner who's managed to smuggle a firearm in. Now, we don't know exactly what happened there, but what we do know is that they were going through the new processes as a part of trying to keep prisoners safe from COVID-19, so keeping them separate, doing things in different ways, a greater focus on social distancing and less interaction. And some of that is almost certainly coming from us not having really worked through how we protect our officers in these circumstances. So what I want to do now is just sort of have a little bit of a look at these demonstrations and do it from the point of view of looking at two statues. So we had on the left-hand side of here a statue of a guy called Colston, which is in Bristol. Bristol's a relatively large city in the west of England. And there was a demonstration there, and the demonstration was very much about the slave trade on the back of Black Lives Matter. And on the right-hand side, we had a demonstration in central London, and this demonstration about the same thing was looking at, ended up being focused around the statue of Winston Churchill. So Winston Churchill, the leader during the Second World War in the United Kingdom, and often voted as the greatest leader of all time by British people, and yet has this sort of racist potential element in his background. Well, not potential, but some things he did early on in his career which clearly were not in terms of treating people fairly. And that's always suppressed because he did such a phenomenal thing in bringing the country together at a time of war. So a man who's got a lot of support and who was seen as a figurehead, if you like, for a lot of British values. So the demonstration in Bristol was very heated. There was some violence, it got going, but the police made a decision not to stop the demonstrators from pulling the statue down and eventually throwing it into the lock. Sorry, not into the lock, into the bay. I moved countries there to Scotland for a moment. I don't know how that happened. So there's a dock in Bristol. It's a town which has got a huge history in the slave trade in terms of places where people came through. And Colston put a lot of money into Bristol So all of these things came together. But the policing decision was one to step back, to collect evidence, and not to have a big debate with the demonstrators trying to stop them and not use force. In London, police started off with a fairly low-key operation. You can see from the images on the top on the right that people were allowed around. People climbed up onto the statue and tried to take a similar sort of approach. The problem with that was that it led to other people coming out to demonstrate against the demonstrators, and then we had the fairly severe disorder that you see in the middle picture, which went through central London. So very different approaches to problems. The one on the left, there were a few police injuries, but nothing too serious. The one on the right, there were a lot of arrests and a lot of police injured. I think what's interesting from an international concept is to look at how close the police are to the crowd. Policing in the UK is very different in terms of major disorder policing. Keeping a distance between the two is often very small distance. It's not like you would expect, for instance, in America, where there will be a large distance, or many countries where the use of CS gas and other ballistics are used to keep a gap between them. We're lucky that quite often we don't have knives, we don't have that many knives, and we don't normally have firearms being used in demonstrations. So we can take more risks, but it is a very different model. And you can see the small amount of PPE that the officers are wearing. All they've got is their batons, and obviously they're wearing ballistic vests as well. So there's no, they got very close and very involved with them. And the violence on the left at Bristol was focused on the statue. The violence on the right became focused on the police officers. So there's a real difference between the two in terms of what happened. You can explain completely that in both the policing strategies were to police with the minimum use of force. Both they would have been not to interact and to take direct action unless needed. But the one on the right, because of the symbolism of Churchill and the number of people who came out, there was a real change. What was most interesting, if you look at the picture on the bottom right, was when the BLM, a couple of the Black Lives Matter demonstrators, ended up rescuing a far-right demonstrator who'd been fighting them shortly after he'd collapsed in the demonstration. And that was quite an interesting sort of turning point, I think, in the way that the press and the way that the public thought about what was going on. We began to see people as individuals rather than those who support Black Lives Matter and those who support traditional British values. The one, this is May 2020, right at the height of COVID in London. And you'll see a few of the demonstrators are wearing face coverings. I can't see a single police officer there wearing gloves or a mask or doing anything to protect themselves. And I think that is a real big issue for policing, that we have not protected our officers from the disease. And also, because of the way that we are having to act, we're not protecting our officers from attacks in the way that maybe we should be. And then I just want to talk a little bit about the knees. This is a picture in America of a demonstration. As you'll see, the big difference is that the officers have paramilitary dress. They are a long way from the crowd. You can't really see from this image, but there is a lot of weaponry being pointed at the crowd to keep them at a distance. And they're all taking a knee. Now, the debate we'll have in a moment is why they were taking the knee and what that showed. And the picture on the right, this is the demonstration in Whitehall that we saw in a couple of slides back. But we see here the officers early on interacting with the crowd on a very personal level. So a very different approach to policing. So the points I wanted to get across with looking at these two on the policing tactics are threefold. Is that policing strategy in Bristol, the policing strategy in London was very similar. However, the object of the demonstration, somebody who is of much less significance to the national culture in Bristol compared with Winston Churchill in the UK, in London, changed the level of interaction that the police had to take, changed what the police had to do to prevent that being damaged through the demonstration. But as you'll see on the right, the police officers still started off with the same next to no PPE, very close to the crowd and personally interacting. And the question, that we generally like to ask is, do we think the officers on the right were taking a knee out of personal choice in a way that was making a difference to engage the public? And do we think the officers in America on the left were taking it because they've been told to do so as part of some generic message? And I think those are the sorts of things we need to look at. So what I wanted to just sort of ask you to think about and to try and have a bit of discussion out is these sorts of issues. If we just start off with, what do people think the impact of social media has been to policing these type of incidents from your perspectives? It'd be really, really good to hear from people from other countries, and not necessarily talking about disorder, the top end, but really talking about how social media has impacted on policing and COVID-19 and general issues in the last year. So I'm just having a look to see who we've got here from maybe somewhere a little bit further apart. But I wondered whether, Javier, whether you've got any thoughts on this, or whether there's any international perspective that would be really useful to get in here. Somehow a silence on a video conference is considerably worse than in public.
Well, they're just collecting their thoughts. I wonder if Abigail would just like to raise the points that she's made and just ask her question at the end about clarity around targeting. There was, just to go back to the chat, what people think about social media, there was a debate about dealing with inequality within the police and whether the recruitment of more officers from ethnic minority groups was the answer, or was it counterproductive because they're seen as stepping outside their community to join the police. Two schools of thought, yes, reflected role models, positive role models, but those role models then were being stifled in promotion. So that's where a positive thing turned negative, but also were those BAME officers actually carrying out policies that were seen as discriminatory? So therefore, were they in fact just being drawn into the problem and not part of the solution? And that was something that Abigail raised that was quite hotly debated in the chat while you were talking. I don't know what you think.
I think those are, I think this is a whole really interesting area. So if I start with, in the UK, we have set within law targets for trying to represent a similar number of police officers from different ethnic backgrounds to society. It came out that Stephen Lawrence, it's one of the recommendations and a requirement for forces to achieve it. However, I think that misses the point. Is just having a target and recruiting people doesn't really deal with some of the issues that you're touching on there. Firstly, if the experience of people from a certain part of society is that black officers are part of an organisation which promotes inequality and unfairness to them, then those black officers are not really making any difference, because they're not seen as part of a solution. They're just seen as more of the same problem. And it's, in some ways, it becomes almost a racist thing that we have to have black people because only black people can deal with this. Well, actually, we can all deal with it. We should all be challenging these sorts of aspects. So I think there's that element. The other element around it, which I think is really, really important, is people who are second and third generation UK nationals, or people who even first generation who've come here from other countries, have two different stories about policing. They have stories about policing of the country which they came from, and they have stories about policing in the UK. And those quite often get conflated. So you end up with people not trusting the police here because the country that they left, maybe because they were escaping something happening in that country to them, they didn't agree with the policing approach there, and they think that must be the same policing approach here, so they distrust the police to start with. Secondly, if they've seen lots of negative experiences, all of that builds up to people thinking, well, why would I join the police? And for those people who do join the police, it creates a number of debates within their family as to why they're joining the police. So we have to realise that people who make a career decision to come into policing, who come from these diverse communities, actually come so quite often, not always, please don't think this is a message about it, but quite often come within a lack of support. And all of us who've been police officers know that your family and your friends support you through some really difficult times, and the more support you have outside the organisation, the better. So you've got that going on, and then you've got these officers, not these officers, all officers are subject to attacks at different times in different ways. You know, you're in a position of conflict. If it feeds into a debate about why did you join, you're a traitor, you've turned against the cause, all those things play out in people. So that's really important, that we have to understand, and everybody has to understand the extra step that many people have taken to join in the police, and everybody takes a big step to join. The other element I think we have to then look at is, why on earth are the systems within policing, do they lead to these disproportionate outcomes? Why are black and ethnic minority officers far more likely to have allegations made against them, far more likely to have that allegation lead to a discipline outcome, and far more likely to be dismissed or leave the force as a result of that than white officers? And that whole element needs to be looked at, not in terms of just saying, well, people don't need to agree with people should be allowed to do whatever they want, but we need to understand why it's happening. And the other thing we need to understand is progression rates. Why are there so few black and ethnic minority officers, particularly when you put other elements of diversity like male and female on, moving through the ranks? And it's not just a question about this takes many years, it's a question about people are not getting through processes time and time again. Barriers that we understand are removed and then they're put back in. So there's lots of issues that need to be resolved to make a difference for those officers. So Abigail raised a really interesting around the use of social media, providing a direct voice to the public, and I think that is really true. But I also think there are loads of problems with social media that we haven't quite sorted as yet. So I know that there's a Home Office, not Home Office, an inspectorate of policing in the UK, which is going to look at data compliance issues around the use of social media, and where personal data is being moved around WhatsApp groups, where officers are engaging in conversations that they shouldn't be having in public. So there's a whole thing about the officers really understanding what it is they're involved in and what they should be using social media for. and how they do it, as well as it just being a tool that is really useful. I think that's something that we need to be looking at.
Rod, David's raised his hand. I don't know if you just want to bring him in there.
Yeah, go on then.
Dave, do you want to make your point?
So Dave, you might be on mute.
That's it. Try again, Dave. Okay, come back to Dave then.
So I think in the chat, David raised his own experience from working as a volunteer in a migrant worker group and the amount of distrust he's seeing there. I think we seem to forget in our concern about language and about how we talk about people from different backgrounds. We seem to forget that quite a large number of the population in the UK who are black and ethnic from minority ethnic communities are either first, second generation or themselves migrants. And I come back to this whole issue about long and short memories. If your family story is about police corruption in a country that your family have had to flee because of this, or police brutality, then it takes an awful lot to overcome that. So these symbols and these histories become really important when we're thinking about how the police work. And it's really important that police get involved with that. And I think Javeer's comment about compliance after a police encounter, if they think they've been treated fairly, I cannot agree more with this. One of the roles I had in the United Kingdom was as the lead for the use of stop and search powers for counter-terrorism offences. It used to be Section 44, which gave, when authority had been given, police the power to search anyone. And we had huge complaints with it and huge problems, distrust, particularly from Asian communities. And we managed to change that just by instructing officers who were using it in saying a few words, which were basically, we're trying to stop terrorism. Can you help us do that by letting me search you? Rather than saying what they have been saying, which is, I'm going to search you under the counter-terrorism laws. So I think that is a real, if you can get the way that the police start their encounter, the officers start their conversations right, it makes a big, big difference. And I love your use of engage, explain, encourage, and enforce. This whole thinking through a process of what we're trying to do and not just thinking about enforcement. And I would tie that back to the earlier discussion about political leaders. If political leaders are talking about law enforcement and about giving the police the powers to enforce the law, rather than talking about how society, supporting by police, supported by everybody, needs to act differently, and this is what needs to happen. And if we need to, we will use enforcement, but that is a last resort, is a really important change in the message. Javier, it'd be really interesting to hear about your thoughts on public opinion from Peru. It's not a country that we have a lot of knowledge of, and I know you're going to speak next week in detail, but if there was anything particular around this that you could give to us, that would be really useful. Karen, is there anything there that I've missed?
I've just been speaking with our colleagues in Cambodia just to see whether there's anything that they, any perspective that they feel comfortable sharing. So I'm just going to go back to the chat now and just have a quick catch up.
So Dave's raised an issue, raised an example of from when he was working in central London, Strand and Whitehall, which is right in the heart of London, and how Filipina, Nigerian and French nationals were able to bring so much difference in terms of their views of what was going on, and how beneficial it was, and how we should be doing more thinking about these things. And as always, David moved into the fact that it was great fun as well, because I think we should remember, in amongst all of this, that for most of us, policing is a really serious and important aspect, and police officers do some of the most incredible tasks. But it should also be something which brings out the positive side of people's nature, and people should be doing things that are enjoyable. So I really like this comment about social media, the image of demonstration, but actually planning and organising looks like political image. So what should police do in these circumstances? I think that's really important. That the sort of border, if you like, the balance between engaging with people to talk to them and find out what's happening and deal with issues on the one hand, and on the other hand looking like you're just trying to promote a political position, and that it's not good, and it's all just trying to cover things up. Really important. And also, of course, you know, we need to use the social media aspect very carefully, because there's also Big Brother. You know, there's this whole concept of us watching people through social media, and people not really realizing that things are in the public domain when they put them up on slides is really important. So I think the way you have to be, and the evidence shows that the clearer you are about your message and the more sustained you are about the same thing, and you do it in a term that listens to people as well as says things, is more important. So we move again from the concept of informing people into engaging and involving them in what's happening.
Rod, can we just bring Major General Rex Saru in here, just who'd like to make a comment?
Good morning or good afternoon, Major General. Very good to hear from you.
Yes, can you hear me, please?
Yes, very clearly, thank you.
Okay, so we had internal discussion and just a few points of view to share in relation to the impact of social media with the policing in Cambodia. In general, we found that social media is a positive signal to us. Most of the time, they inform the public in general about the crime happening at local level, or, you know, what we call the social anti-behavior which happens in the public, like street or the places. So they notify people in general, and they notify the police. So it's a good sign of that. That's one thing. So police pay attention to that. It leads to the prevention of crime as well as crime investigation in the timely manner. Second thing, social media also impact the policing in general, especially to the individual bad police who misbehave, which not following the code of conduct or following the what we call the police regulation in Cambodia. So this is one good thing. And also at present we are experiencing the flood situation across the country. So also social media give good attention to the public as well as to police and the armed force in general. We can immediately identify particular place which are flooding and situation may be causing danger to the people, and we can deploy the police and to save lives on timely manner. So in general, if we talk about the work policing and public relations. In general, it's okay, except some few negative case of individual manner between, we can say, over react of the individual police in very minor case with the the anger the public should have any problems, for example, the traffic behavior on the street and so on, or sometimes they have their quarrel on the street and so on. So in general, it's okay. So this is just a few words sharing from Cambodia context. Thank you.
Rex, so thank you very much for that. I think one thing I'd like to add to that is when we visited you earlier on this year, it seems like more than a few months ago. When we visited you, one thing that struck me was the openness with which social media was used by your senior politicians as well as within the police, and it seems like a more sophisticated approach than we've yet designed over here. Part of that may well just be that society is different, and it's a smaller society, a smaller number of people, and is therefore able to have a more open conversation. But it did seem something very important was happening there.
Yes, yes.
So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you.
I think Javier sort of talked about social consciousness, self-security, feeling of population is undermined if the mass media from the mass media effect of social media, and how much trauma that can cause. I think we haven't really talked about this, but this concept of echo chambers, I don't like these sort of discussions. But the fact that the way social media platforms work is that they push you, would be a better way of putting it, towards interacting with people with similar views and similar backgrounds to yourself. So if that is happening, and somebody is giving you a message which, you know, is something that you're a little bit aware of, actually suddenly getting a load of messages about the same thing make you hypersensitive, increase your sensitivity to these issues, and therefore change your opinion, polarize it to some degree, push you down a certain path. Whereas actually, if it was a more open conversation, you'd be able to stabilize what was going on. So part of this, now I really am sort of moving out where I should be talking about, but part of this for me is about thinking that social media, everybody thinking that social media is this wonderfully good open tool, without realizing that at the back of it is something which is designed to make money for companies who run social media platforms, and therefore it will do things that get the greatest amount of traction regardless of the political and community outcomes. So I think we're right up to the 10:30 deadline. Really pleased to get so many comments coming towards the end, and tomorrow when we come back, first thing I want to do is just to pick up on a few of these points and to try and push them a little bit further and to look a little bit more about what we could do. Can I thank you all very much for being involved, and just ask you to go away and think specifically about the impact on individual officers that all of this must be having, and what you think that impact is having in terms of service provision by the police and what we must do for the future. So in the meantime, thank you very much. Stay safe, and we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks, Rod. Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you.